Hello to the Psychedelics Conference. You're looking good. My name is Kaleb Smith, and I hope you've been having an informative conference experience thus far. There's some fantastic topics being explored by the many speakers, and some great conversations to be had around those topics. My own topic that I'll be exploring today involves an area of research very pertinent to the psychedelic renaissance and all of the research that's coming out and will continue to come out, hopefully, is states of consciousness, specifically non-ordinary states of consciousness, and the many systems that exist, models of consciousness that are interrelated, and I hope to contribute something meaningful and valuable to the future work that will be exploring dramatically varied states of consciousness and how to map them. So let's get right to it. I'll start with some slides. Here we go. So, more specifically, this presentation will explore state-dependent perceptions and how they may be studied, represented, and integrated into models of consciousness which already exist. So, to begin at the beginning, my own training is in the field of transpersonal psychology, what some have referred to in shorthand as spiritual or psychedelic psychology. Transpersonal psych was created really when the hippies of the San Francisco Bay Area began to get their doctorates. I'm sure you've heard this quote by Leary, but Leary was not alone in this sentiment. The founder of my school, Jim Fadiman, said something very similar after his first psilocybin experience with his faculty advisor, Richard Alpert, who would later become Ram Dass, that these psychedelics are tools like microscopes, affording fantastic insights and perspectives on the workings of the human mind, so much so that they deserve their own field of psychology, dedicated. Brainstorming at Esalen Institute, they eventually lifted Stan Grof's term, transpersonal, which he had coined originally to describe exceptional states of empathy, which he was seeing among his research subjects in his LSD studies, that these subjects were transcending the personal to, if only for a moment, to fully identify themselves with another person, or even in some cases a non-person. But specifically, I originally was seeking to work under one specific researcher at ITP. That was the parapsychologist and consciousness researcher Dr. Charles Tart, who had coined the term altered state of consciousness from his seminal 1969 text of the same name. I originally sought him out to replicate his breakthrough UC Davis sleep lab research into the out-of-body experience, but Tart began approaching consciousness in a fundamental a way as possible, part of which involved identifying many discrete states of consciousness that an individual may access. These could be as simple as sleepy or hypervigilant states of consciousness, or a full pot of coffee consciousness, 2 Monster energy drinks in state of consciousness. Honestly, there's innumerably subtle and dramatic variance in our state of consciousness from baseline that we may experience throughout our day, or for these more exceptional extremes throughout our lifetime. Among the more mainstream concepts to derive from this systems approach to consciousness Tart pioneered is that of state-dependent memory. Most simply, he and other researchers found that if you learn something while in a specific, what he'd call a discrete state of consciousness, you can only recall it effectively when you return to that specific state of consciousness. For example, Students who crammed for an exam while chugging coffee all night before the exam could only accurately retrieve all that they had learned when they were chugging that pot of coffee when they again chugged another pot of coffee. The memory recall was bound to and contained within that given state of consciousness. And that's all fine for coffee and alcohol, but how does that apply to psychedelic substances that are known, of course, to induce states of consciousness dramatically different from our baseline waking state? That is where we begin to veer into decidedly wilder and less explored territory. With the most extreme, not ordinary states of consciousness induced by DMT, salvia divinorum, or even exceptional near-death experiences, for instance. Experiencers often describe a sudden flood of recollection upon crossing over into the state once again. A lot of times it's like an aha moment, like, I've been here before. For instance, DMT, the memory is bound to a specific state or region of consciousness existing far from our normal baseline waking state. The other side of that coin is, of course, the experience of an almost amnesia-like memory loss. The amnesia is especially prevalent in salvia divinorum, something that impedes research and integration of the sacrament significantly. These extreme states of consciousness differ so dramatically from our normal state of awareness. The closest naturally occurring state we can even compare it to is that of an intense dream. And much like a dream, by the time our feet hit the floor, that memory is completely gone. And with the topic of sleep, we introduce the oldest and most primary means of quantitatively measuring an individual's state of consciousness as it descends towards sleep. And what exactly is descending in that instance? Or what do New Age hippies mean when they say things like higher or lower vibrational states of consciousness, if they themselves even know what they're talking about? With EEG, we have a means of measuring a fundamental aspect of consciousness as an electromagnetic frequency, radiating across and out from the cortex as ever-shifting modulatory fields, competing for influence and cortical real estate with so much action potential. EEG is, of course, an expansive area of research literature, well beyond the scope of this presentation, but more broadly, the oscillatory fields of electromagnetic radiation quantitatively measured by the EEG array correlates to the billions of firing rates of individual neurons, their rhythmic relationships spreading or inhibiting in response to our perceptual experience and state of consciousness as fields we can identify and catalog into a set of specific bandwidths. That is to say, these firing rates that ripple and radiate across our cortex are reducible to a set of frequency ranges oscillating at established regions of the brain. Signature patterns measured along the points of high-resolution EEG arrays can correlate to distinctive states of parasympathetic arousal. But if being honest, even with over a century of study, the science of our brain's electromagnetic fields is still rudimentary, akin to trying to identify all of the components and parts of your car's engine solely by measuring the vibrations along its hood. But more importantly, for our purposes, is the broader glimpse of consciousness as a spectrum of varied frequencies, bound and divided into discrete bandwidths. If we are truly to map the many individual states of consciousness, including those exceptional states induced by psychedelic sacraments, this spectrum of consciousness is going to be key, as it implies the fundamentals of the waveform dynamics, electromagnetic frequency, and permits oscillatory fields relevant to our study to be represented as regions, ranges, and bandwidths of consciousness, which once experienced can be mapped for future reference. This spectral map is of key importance if we hope to return to that range or state of consciousness, as in research studies which are able to show within subject replicability. I won't spend too much time on the oscillatory bandwidths of sleep, as that is likely a review for all of you. It is worth noting that within each of these bandwidths, gamma through delta, exists many distinct subbands or channels of specific significance. Many sleep lab researchers defining several dozen such subband channels. Psychedelics like ayahuasca, transcendental meditation, or shamanic trance can all be mapped along this spectrum as well. Waking awareness existing through beta and alpha. Suffice it to say, electromagnetic correlates of psychedelics like ayahuasca can be mapped along this spectrum as well. While at Stanford, I actually completed a pilot study of isochronic brainwave entrainment using sound and stroboscopic stimuli to induce dramatic shifts in a participant's state of consciousness, starting from beta down to around low theta, measured using a 64-channel geodesic array. Rare states of global coherence were seen in several of these subjects, but that's a whole other presentation in itself. The main point of this graphical representation of specific bandwidths of electromagnetic phenomenon here is to link consciousness more generally to how electromagnetism and modulatory phenomenon in general exist in nature. For instance, our grade school science textbooks always showed the visible range of the EM spectrum as this sort of big monolithic bar on the left, referred to as Roy G. Biv. Yet this is clearly not how radiation exists in the natural world, is it? Rather, modulatory phenomenon in nature truly radiate outwards in all directions from a centermost source point. Equating frequency and medium density is key to understanding how mediums settle into bandwidths with clear boundaries. Imagining observable examples of this in nature is very helpful. For instance, imagine the calm surface of a pond. This is an example of a denser medium, the body of water, meeting a finer medium, that of the air, along its boundary. Each discrete bandwidth of electromagnetism can be thought of as that bound surface of water meeting air. Now, imagine as a kid throwing a huge rock into the center of that calm boundary separating the two mediums. That point, where the stone meets the perfectly calm surface, introduces modulation, as waves radiate outwards from that point of contact, crest and trough, rippling the specific signature of that rock outwards across time. These waves are eventually picked up by the frogs at the edge of the pond to be sensed and perceived as conscious experience, interpreted as either innocuous or a threat. Most basically, it is in the mechanics of this observable range of nature that we can better understand the waveform dynamics of nature's unobservable ranges as well, that of modulatory phenomenon. radiating outwards from a centermost point of contact. Radio waves, while we cannot see them with our naked senses, adhere to the same waveform dynamics governing our pond, albeit within a much finer medium. This bandwidth of the electromagnetic spectrum can carry conscious information to traverse the boundary of a range of frequency to be received at a different location. More than merely a metaphor, what understanding of consciousness can we derive from this system? Well, for one, by more clearly understanding these fundamentals that govern the transmission of modulatory phenomenon in nature, we can see that our conscious experience is actually composed of a dual nature, a carrier medium, much like the surface of that perfectly placid pond, and the modulator source, the stimuli generated within that medium transmitted across it as information, which may be received and interpreted by conscious entities with the appropriate sensory capacity. This carrier-modulator duality of waveform transmission is expressed here within the radio bandwidth of the EM spectrum. And by focusing in more closely on how information travels and is received within this one frequency range, we can better understand the dual nature of how our 5 sensory organs receive information from our own surroundings, but also how techniques to raise or lower our state of consciousness can be conceptualized using the radio receiver as a metaphor. Imagine the shaman, traditionally using drumming frequency or psychedelics to change his or her state of consciousness, can be thought of as having mastered the ability to ascend or descend this spectrum of frequency, turning that radio dial from his baseline station, exploring until crossing over a bandwidth, until all at once a new station is perceived. Imagine hearing a different station for the first time, say a Mexican radio station, just crackling alive with a wholly different range of information, an entirely different language, an entirely different culture, all of it foreign from anything we had heard before. How incredible and foreign that experience, realizing that entirely different station has existed and evolved right alongside our own this whole time. It's not unlike many people's description of ascending to a higher state of consciousness using DMT for the first time. That crossing over into a higher bandwidth of consciousness and the sudden burst of non-ordinary information being transmitted along that higher station or channel, suddenly being perceived for the first time. Now that is what is meant by state-dependent perception, that much like memory, certain perceptions are bound within a specific state of consciousness. That content can only be received by crossing over into that state of consciousness. A more powerful conception of this state-dependent perception, if we return to our image of the boy throwing rocks into that body of water, comes if we imagine that same young man eventually getting brave enough to enter and immerse himself into that medium of water, diving down beneath the surface, and for the first time opening his eyes, and all at once a whole world of living conscious life which had been hidden from him is revealed. An entire ecosystem that, unbeknownst to him, had existed alongside his own all this time. That sense of awe and splendor at the beauty and foreignness of this rich ecosystem, but these perceptions only became available to him when he crossed over that boundary into a denser medium of nature. This is how I have come to understand the journey of the psychonautic shaman, learning to control and master his breath in order to cross boundaries of consciousness to explore whole realms of spirit hidden from the typical person who can be thought of as contented on dry land. Mastery implies entering this non-ordinary range of nature with intention, learning specific locations, specific species of life, learning to dive down for pearls and bring them back for our benefit. These are the lost skill sets which compose our species' oldest profession. Skills we are at the cusp of rediscovering. Thank you. Here's my contact information if you'd like to continue this discussion.